Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone. My name is Sadia Hussain Baloch, and I am excited to present to you Dr. Celene Ibrahim for the second in her series on women and gender in the Quran. For those of you who attended last week, you heard that Dr. Ibrahim is a much esteemed scholar in our community. She is on the faculty of the Qura'n School, the Faculty of Religious Studies, and also Muslim chaplain there, as well as being a faculty at Boston Islamic Seminary. And I have to say that I had a great personal experience for 10 days with Dr. Celene Ibrahim, because in December of 2018, she was the leader of our Umrah group. We visited Mecca and Medina, the sites, and it was a wonderful experience for all four of our family. We took our daughters also. Interestingly enough, this was a group that was probably majority women. There were men, but for example, our family was three women and one man. Celene's family was also 3 women and 1 man, including her husband and her mother-in-law and her daughter. But it was just such an uplifting experience. And I learned about spaces in the Haram in Mecca and in Medina that I didn't know were accessible to women when I had gone for Hajj, and maybe they weren't at Hajj time, but they were at Umrah time. That was wonderful. So today's topic is how are female figures different from male figures in the Quran? And Celene, you have your presentation up, so I will let you start.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to everybody. Alhamdulillah that we can gather in this way. Thank you so much, Sister Sadia, for a beautiful introduction, and for the Islamic Society of Boston and Wayland for hosting these lectures. Inshallah, tonight will be a conversation on Hawa, the first woman in Islamic sacred history, the wife of Adam, who is considered by most Muslims to be a prophet. So if we think about first what distinguishes women and men in an Islamic paradigm in terms of spirituality, we find that the Qur'an is very emphatic. This is probably one of the most, although not the only, Quranic verse that emphasizes that the paradigm of character, the paradigm of devotion, of all of these virtues here are as accessible for women as they are for men. So there is, throughout the Quran, no distinguishing factor made between the spiritual potential and worth of women compared to men. There we go, we got to mute. So in a minute here, I'm going to shift to the Arabic of this text right here, and you can see that the words are repeated one for one in terms of giving an example of what is considered a righteous human being. So I'm going to move my cursor along here, and you can see verily the Muslimin. So these are here referring in general to Muslims, but specifically when it's contrasted with Muslimat, which are female Muslims specifically. So you see this ending here, for those who are maybe learning some Arabic, is the ending that means the plural for the feminine. So here, well, the word Muslimin, or the second word here, al-mu'minin, mu'min coming from the word that means trust and security in Arabic. So the ones who have faith, who have this level of trust and security, are the mu'minin, which generally would include women normally, but the Quran is absolutely emphatic that women are included in this by giving this plural ending, the mu'minat, which is the female believers, those who have faith. And so you can see here all of the adjectives here that are describing the people who have faith and piety. So the verse then says, to all of these people, God has promised forgiveness and a great reward. So this is just one verse where we find the spiritual potential absolutely articulated in no uncertain terms. And there's many places in the Quran where the idea of pairs is lifted up as an example of the way in which God created. And this, I elaborate this in the book for those of you who are reading it, but one of the signs of God's unity and unicity and uniqueness is that everything else needs other beings to procreate, to create. So God alone stands in majesty, being the one without what we say in Arabic, kufu, which is without a partner, without any equivalent. So from our understanding as Muslims, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala needs no partner, does not beget, nor was begotten, nor does Allah have a partner. And from ourselves, we can't make another human being, except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala requires that we have a partner in order to have a child and to continue the human species. And this is true of all different types of species, not just the human species. So right here, I wanted to call your attention to this word, zawjain, right here in the center. And so a zawj is a spouse. And in many verses of the Qur'an, this idea of a spouse is used to show that in the Quranic understanding of the universe, a spouse is like a beautiful complementary pair. Another verse of the Quran speaks about spouses, here human spouses, right, as clothing for one another. Clothing, the likeness of clothing being something that protects, that comforts, that is intimate. And so the language around spouses in the Quran is very beautiful. There's also a numerous language that ties the idea of male and female to things like night and day and other cosmic phenomenon, the salty seas and the fresh water that have a duality to them. When we come into the contemporary world, we see that, yes, we recognize some children, for instance, are born and they're intersex, but on the whole, we do still find that the human species has mostly male, mostly female. And that is part of the signs, the ayat, that Allah has put, that God has put into the creation to help us contemplate the nature of our reality. So when we're thinking about Hawa, the first woman, and her stories in the Quran, we're going to see both of these points. This point that I first showed about the spiritual equality here, we're going to see that part echoed in the story of Hawa, and we're going to see the part about the zawj and the idea of this reproductive complementary pair. So let's take a look. We have a few topics to get through tonight, and I hope to leave time for a lot of questions and answers, God willing. So the story, if you're coming to this lecture familiar with a biblical background, is somewhat similar to the biblical accounts. There is a controversy about depicting figures and using figurative art, but I did just want to put on our slideshow this, this illustration here in order to call your attention just to a few things. Now, in this illustration, you see teeny tiny in the background here, you do see a little snake. Now, there is no mention of a snake in the Quran. So I've been at a number of interreligious dialogues where this story comes up and people are discussing it and unpacking the symbolism, and Muslims will sit there and kind of try to figure out, why is everyone talking about a snake? Like, how did a snake is not mentioned in the Quran at all. There is a tree. The couple do eat from the tree. As I'll show you in a minute here, the emphasis in the Quranic version is actually not on Hawa, not on Eve being the one who eats from the tree and then convinces Adam. If that story is found in the Muslim tradition, that actually comes from the biblical tradition and then into Islam. It's not necessarily part of the Quranic story or part of any hadith that I personally have ever seen. So let's take a look at a few things regarding this story. So one is, when the couple do realize that, oh no, we've eaten from the tree. God said, eat whatever you want from this garden, just don't eat that thing. And in our humanity, we were, we either forgot or we were so curious we had to try that one thing that we were forbidden. And so in the Qur'an, the couple together say, our Lord, we have wronged ourselves. Now, if you remember the first lecture, if you were here for my previous lecture last Thursday, you remember that I showed you the Queen of Sheba said these words. We saw Moses saying these words. So this is the first time in sacred history, according to kind of the Quranic framework, that human beings, these are the first human beings, and here they are using these same words. So it is this perpetual trope that human beings are continually wronging ourselves. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we go on tonight. And then they're speaking to God here, and they say, notice this is the two of them speaking together. They say, if you do not forgive us and have mercy upon us, surely we will be among the losers. Now, of course, God in the the nature of the divine being, Azza wa Jalla, in Allah's greatness, is Arham al-Rahimin, the most merciful of those who have mercy. So this is an example of tauba, what we would call in the Islamic tradition, or for the Hebrew speakers in the room, potentially tshuva. This is the repentance in that journey of realizing, oh, what I just did was wrong, and I can turn in repentance. And you notice here that there is a even on the part of these first beings in the garden, there's an awareness. Ooh, 1 second, someone's vacuuming upstairs. So just one second here. Let me just fix that. Hold on. Sorry about that. It's awesome when things are getting cleaned up. So I'm really, really happy about that. Sorry about that. So when we think about Bismillah, when we think about these first beings, these first human beings, they already have that instinctual tauba in them. We could also say that when God taught Adam the words, for those of you who know Surah Al-Baqarah, there is opinions that say these were the words, those words of tauba that I just showed you. There is an opinion that those were what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah the most great, the most high, taught Adam alayhi salam when he received words from his Lord, as Surah Al-Baqarah tells us. So I wanted to pause for a minute in this story and say, what is even the purpose of human life in a Quranic scheme? So we have on the one hand that God, and here the pronoun he, this is not taken to be a male in any way. This is the pronoun that refers to God in the Arabic language. So God created the heavens and the earth in truth. And you see this comparison between the night and the day, and the sun and the moon are each subservient. Now we come to the human being. So God created you, and this is talking directly to the human being, from a single soul, then made from, and I have here her because the soul is gendered feminine in Arabic, just like God is gendered masculine. Here is just a pronoun. The pronoun for the human soul in the Qur'an is gendered feminine. So from this single soul right here, God made two beings and sent, and then it talks about other types of beings that God has also made. And this process, this miraculous process of the womb, creation after creation, meaning this development of the fetus in the womb, in threefold darkness. Many commentators say the threefold darkness that this particular verse is talking about is the abdomen, and then the womb itself, the uterus, if you will, and then the placenta. So there is an argument that those are the threefold darkness, that is what that refers to in the verse. So all of these things, the signs in the cosmos, from the sun and the moon to the human being and the way the human being procreates here, are signs of the divine majesty. So when we come to the first, human being, and here's the verse in Arabic. You see the azwaj here, that's the pairs. So just like human beings are pairs, animals are also created in pairs. So when we come to the first couple, where are they being created? Are they being created in another realm, and then they're being sent down from the earth? As we'll see in a minute when we look at the Quranic verses, God says, get down from here, meaning a place that they were in, and then they descend from it. The commentators actually throughout Islamic history have different opinions about whether they were in the paradisal gardens and then they get sent down from the paradisal gardens, or maybe they were in a specific garden in earth and they get sent down to a different part of the earth. We have traditions that say that that Adam and Hawa were created in another realm, and when they come down to the earth, Adam lands close to Mecca, and Hawa lands, Adam lands in, some say in Sri Lanka, and some say Hawa lands close to Mecca. So we have all different stories about those original, theories about how the initial appearance of human beings on the earth. None of this is Quranic. What we have in the Quran is simply dropping us into the story where they eat from the tree, where they realize their nakedness, where they cover themselves with leaves from the garden. But what we have is these many different Quranic verses from Surah Al-Araf, which is the 7th chapter, the 7th surah of the Quran, to also Surah Taha has these verses at the very end that also narrate this story, and Surah Al-Baqarah. These are the main places in the Quran. And if you're looking at the slides, you can see that there is similar language, but each surah emphasizes a slightly different part of the story. So in some Quranic verses, as we have here in Surah Al-Araf, which is actually in the chronological order of the Mus'haf, one of the first to be revealed. So thus he, Satan, lured them through deception. Deception is the kind of primary means of operation of Shaitan. So when they tasted of the tree, their nakedness was exposed to them. And again, both the dual, notice they tasted of the tree, the dual form in Arabic, meaning they're doing it together. And they began to sow the leaves of the garden to cover themselves. And their Lord, again in the dual, called out to them and said, did I not forbid you from that tree and tell you that Satan is a manifest enemy unto you? So this is the first time in the Mus'haf, in the Quran, the whole Quran, that this story is in the revelatory order of the Mus'haf. So the first time the Muslims in Arabia are hearing this story, this is how they're hearing it. So they're hearing it not as Hawa is uniquely to blame or something for the fall of humankind. They're hearing the story in the dual, where both are acting together. And then God says, get down, each of you, an enemy to the other. Some people interpret this verse to signify some type of male-female animosity. I think the better interpretation here is to say, no, this is the Shaitan and human beings being enemies to one another, because the Shaitan, of course, is, we know from the story prior to this one in sacred history, the Shaitan is seeking to take people off the path. So God said, there will be for you on earth a dwelling place and enjoyment for a while. So these lines here explain sort of how, why human beings are actually upon this earth as this temporary dwelling place. And God says, therein you shall live, and therein you shall die, and from there you shall be brought forth. Now, again, we go down to Taha, Surah Taha, which is in really the middle of the Mus'haf. And again, the story is mentioned, but just very briefly, because it has already been narrated in the consciousness of that first generation of Muslims. And then when we come to Surah Al-Baqarah, which is in the very beginning of the Mus'haf, there we have the story told once again. And this time we have an emphasis on the words of repentance that the couple said together. So the first part, if you're understanding me, the Surah Al-Araf is giving the explanation, the story in its more full sense. Then we have a reminder of it in Taha. We have a few other mentions in places in the Mus'haf of this event, but these are the main verses that repeat God saying to the couple, get down from it. And then God saying to all of them, the couple with Shaitan, all of you get down from it. It meaning the garden. So now if we think about a little more deeply about these verses in Surah Al-Baqarah, when God says to Adam, dwell you and your mate in paradise and eat of the tree and eat of it as you will, eat of paradise, the fruits of paradise as you will, but don't approach the tree. And we see this whole episode. These are verses in Surah Al-Baqarah, again, the second, the major long chapter at the beginning of the Qur'an, from verses 35 to 36. Most interestingly, this is just a little bonus here. These are the first verses in the Mus'haf where God speaks to a female figure. Of course, in this instance, God is talking to both Adam and Hawa together. We find that those in that exact same verse numbers in Surah Al-Imran is the first verse in the Mus'haf where a female figure speaks to God. So we have the exact inverse in those verses in Surah Al-Baqarah, the first place where God is speaking to a woman figure, and those exact same verses in Surah Al-Imran, where a woman figure is speaking to God. Those are just two verses among many that have kind of structural parallels in the Mus'haf. And as has been written about extensively, Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Al-Imran, the third surah, there's many parallels between the two. And so this is just one teeny tiny, what we could say, miracle of the Quranic structure that wouldn't be apparent unless you really go down with a microscopic lens and look at it. So both of those verses have to do with social attitudes that are detrimental to women that were circulating in the time. So if we look at Surah Al-Baqarah, it's refuting, these lines are refuting that Eve, Hawa, was somehow uniquely responsible for the fall of humankind. And then we have in Surah Al-Imran, we have a woman here who dedicates a child in her womb to the service of the temple being like a priestly class run by men. And here she dedicates the baby, and then it's born a girl. And so both of these instances refute kind of endemic, what we can call endemic chauvinism within our religious discourse. You know, in the first instance, that a woman is responsible for the fall of humankind, and in the second instance, that women cannot be kind of wholly, fully dedicated to the service of Allah, as to the service of God, as chosen beings. And of course, the Quran goes on to talk about Mary as, in fact, someone who has been chosen, who has been selected. So, but if we go back to what is this figure of Hawa really telling us? The bad news is that in the whole story that she's a part of, the angels, when Allah creates the first human beings, say essentially, why are you creating this human being that's going to spill blood and create havoc on the earth? So if the angels were in fact right, if we pick our heads up and look at the news, we do tend to spill blood and be heedless, and we fight with one another out of jealousy, like the first the children of Adam and Hawa in the Islamic tradition, Habil and Qabil, fight with one another and one kills the other. We have all of these tendencies within us. Even the first couple, while they don't do anything so terribly wrong, they do make a mistake, they do get sent down. You see that the good news is human transcendence is possible, that we are capable of forging relationships across our various identities, that we can move from ignorance into a state of deep knowledge and awareness, that we can overcome our jealousies, our tendencies to be kind of hasty and judgmental, that all that is in fact possible. And the first human couple, if we think about the woman in this story, she's very much showing that basic human potential that is inherent in all people. Yes, we do make mistakes, but yes, we can kind of get back on the path through tawbah. Now, I wanted to emphasize again a final takeaway point before we can get into a little bit of Q&A, that the world in an Islamic framework, right, and we have to continue to remind ourselves of this as Muslims, inshallah, is that we're here as a test, and that as comfortable as the world can get, or as kind of many flavors of ice cream as we can sample, or as much as we can, and enjoy ourselves in the world, and that there's no harm in enjoying ourselves in the world so long as we keep to the boundaries that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set for us, which are not in fact that difficult if we understand it in the framework of Allah has made lots of things accessible to us and has just made a few things that are barriers. I think we tend and maybe in our contemporary world to think, oh, this is haram and this is haram and this is haram and this is haram, haram being like not permissible. But actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made many, many things permissible. And in Islamic law, things are permissible inherently unless they are specifically forbidden. But the world is a test. And so we do make mistakes, and we just simply, like Hawa, like Adam, learn from the test. Yes, there might be consequences. The first couple had consequences, but that is in fact part of the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God the Most High, designed the system, that this was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Muslim understanding was not surprised that the human being that God created had this tendency. That is in fact part of the programming that we do have. So we can hold ourselves to high standards, but also have mercy on ourselves and know to turn back to God, turn to Allah when we make mistakes. So with that, I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a consciousness to not get caught up in the world, and to, when we do make mistakes, inshallah, to do tawbah and to learn from them. So inshallah, let's open it up for some questions. And again, like it says in the slide, no question is too basic or too deep. This is an exploration that we're doing together, inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim. Can you read the questions in the chat, or would you like me to read them to you?
Oh, let's see. Let me pull up the chat here. We
have 2 questions. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful question here. So I'll read it out. You spoke of a beautiful complementary pair. What do you mean by complementary, right? In some traditions, it has been used against women, limiting their potential by tying them to their biological role. meaning in child rearing, and limiting their lives to this sphere? Yes, that's a great question there. So when the Quran is talking about male-female complementarity, it is talking specifically about the reproductive sphere. And this is just a basic kind of scientific fact that we live with, that we do, even though we can artificially inseminate and the like, we still do need the basic building materials from both sexes in order to have human procreation. Maybe, so from my view, when I'm reading the Quran, most of the discourse around complementarity is related to biological complementarity. We don't actually have verses that liken, for instance, there's not verses that say mothers and fathers are like complementary in their household responsibilities. We don't really find that. We find verses about men ensuring that women are compensated if they're milk nurses. We find verses that talk about both parents having caregiving duties towards children. But in the way that the Quran lays out gender roles, we don't find it in the same framework as we find biological pairing. So spouses we see pairing. So we could say in the marital role, we see some pairing, but that is usually then nestled in some type of allusion to sexuality. So we find verses that talk about the night and the day covering one another, and we find that exact word for covering used to relate to intimacy between spouses. But we don't really find, other than that, when we move into like gendered social roles, we don't find a lot of discourse on complementarity.
Dr. This is a great talk. Thank you so much. Quick question for you. So, when you mentioned the Surah Nisa ayah, when you talked about nafsi wahida, right? And then the spouse, the zawjain came out of that. The question is, just curious, why do people assume it was Adam who was created first and then Hawa? Because that sentence clearly says one soul and then the other soul came from. Doesn't say which one, does it? Or does it?
Yeah, so here's an interesting thing. It gets to how we understand the human, what makes the human being. So in an Islamic understanding, the human being is the ruh, and from the ruh is the immaterial substance, if you will. The ruh is the thing that gives us both a unique identity in life itself, but it also connects us to sort of the breath of God. And then we have our materiality as bodies. And so it seems that we do have, like, the way the Quran talks about the creation of Adam. Adam, by the way, is another word for like clay or like materiality. And we have the word teen, which is like, another a word for, and I understand it personally. Other people don't understand it kind of in this metaphorical way, but I understand it like, okay, there's a materiality, there's a substance involved. And so the human being is both, spirit and material substance. And so on the one hand, if the material substance is created, there's like, from that substance is another substance kind of created, which is sort of how we understand creation in a biological sense, right? Like, the female human body produces eggs, the male human body produces sperm. So there's a sense of a materiality to the creation, but what we bring to it is the perspective of spirituality. And in that case, there is a one united soul that bifurcates. So we could think about it. The idea of a rib, by the way, that comes into our Islamic tradition from the Hebrew tradition, the rib of Adam, so to speak. And sometimes in Hebrew language, the word meaning rib actually means side, in which case, if you're thinking about a metaphor for like bifurcation, the word like side actually has much more of a sense of like one thing coming out of another. So it's, different people have written on this at great length, and I think for kind of contemporary peoples, I think it makes sense for us sometimes to understand things. We can understand them like in a literal sense, but also to think about what is the deeper meaning behind these metaphors. So we have in Quranic language and Islamic language generally, you can have a metaphor. We see this all throughout the Qur'an, where the word like or as is simply removed. So those of you who remember English grammar, you have a simile, which the word as is specifically used, and then you have a metaphor. And so I do understand, and I could be very different from other people on this, I know I am, but I do understand that these things have deep symbolic meaning, as well as potentially just their plain literal meaning.
We have a couple more questions that came in the chat. If you could take a quick look at those.
Yeah, so did you say the Muslims consider Hawa to be a prophet? So Adam is considered to be a prophet for the vast majority of Muslims. And some people give the reasoning because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Baqarah, that very first long chapter of the Qur'an, it says that Allah taught Adam, gave Adam some words. And it's thought that this is a form of revelation. And so the words that then Adam taught these, what I think actually from just a plain reading of the Mus'haf must be that phrase of Tawbah, potentially other things too, but that phrase of Tawbah, that is the kind of model for prophecy. A prophet receives kind of guidance and instruction from God and then teaches it to human beings. What I find so fascinating about the way the Quran presents the story is that we only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives these words to Adam, but we see the couple say the words back together. So when they go to do this repentance, they're doing it together, which I think is a beautiful model for, if we think about spouses today, and we think about, what does it mean to have kind of support one another in piety and to call one another to taqwa being the Arabic word for piety. Here we have a beautiful example of the first couple. Like, we did something wrong together, and together we are returning to God for forgiveness.
There was a question above that from Sue, who asked you if in the Quran, the pronoun which refers to God is the same as the pronoun that refers to man.
Arabic is a gendered language like German or French. Interestingly, German, if we think of that example, we have der, die, das. So we do have a form that is not gendered. We have in English, he, she, it, of course. The Arabic is closer to a French or a Spanish, whereas in every item can have a gender. The gender can change sometimes. So some things can be referred to by one or the other grammatical gender. You do have a greater flexibility. So pronouns are not strictly mapped onto human pronouns like he and she are in English. And so the human pronoun that refers to a man can be huwa. Huwa can also refer to just things that are use that pronoun in Arabic. So it has much more fluidity than gender fluidity, kind of linguistically, Arabic does.
Are there any other questions from the people attending?
Yes, Sister Celene, Assalamu alaikum. If I could just summarize kind of what you were saying, what is the difference, your title today between the way men and women are depicted? Is it that what you're saying is that there is no difference? Is that kind of what the general summary could be?
That's the big takeaway, the big reveal. Not that there is not a difference, because there is a sense of these two different substances, these two different bodies are both needed for the reproduction of the human species, but essentially that's the difference right there.
I just wanted to make so thank you. And I think I agree with the way you presented that. But I just want to make a comment about what was said earlier about the way men and women complement each other. There is that saying about hun libasul lakum wa antum libasul lahun, where they are your garments and you are their garments. And I guess in a way, I think this is a very beautiful illustration of how men and women are a reflection of each other. And the first thing that garments do is to protect you from the atmosphere, from cold, or even from the warmth, and they provide you with shade. And then beyond that, when you're dressed in a certain way, you give a certain message. And so what the Quran is saying is that the men and women kind of complement each other in that kind of way, which I think in a way is not sexual, but kind of supportive. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, that is fascinating to not read it. The reason I do immediately read it in a sexual context is because it does come in a series of verses that talk specifically about husband-wife relations. And so that's the only reason. But I think there's a lot of other verses in the Qur'an that do speak more broadly about one of the verses that I started the series off with, about men and women being awliya of each other, like protecting friends. I think that's a good example of where you have a verse that doesn't necessarily have to be nestled in sort of a male-female intimacy context. And certainly, I think when we get to the realm of gender relations more broadly, and we start, as you'll see, seeing different roles of mothers and fathers. So there are some differences that come out of the social context more. But if we think about here, I think I'm framing it more in kind of the basic constitution of a person, right? We don't find either in like material substance or in the potential for the human spirit, for the human character development. We don't see differences between men and women.
So in the 1 minute that we have left, there was one more question that came in at the end. If you think you can
sure
cover that, or you might just want to rewind to that slide if that would answer it.
Yes, and so I do see one too from Barbara there, a question about
perhaps it's more of a comment. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, oh yeah, comment. So angels in an Islamic worldview are seen as a different type of creation. So even though we do say things like Joseph had the beauty of an angel, it's a comparison. It's not like he was the angel species, because that's actually kind of in an Islamic understanding a different species altogether from human beings. But the question about darknesses, I'll go back to that slide. So the three darknesses in that verse are in a dominant interpretation considered to be the the abdomen, the womb, and the placenta is one way to think about the three darknesses. Oops. So in the beginning of the slideshow, so it's taking me a while to get back to it here. There we go. So may Allah forgive me for any of the shortcomings here, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, may God reward all of you for your efforts, and thank you all for those of you who've come from the interfaith community. It's been an honor to have you here today. For the Muslims, I pray that we are, people who contemplate Allah's signs in ourselves and on the horizons, and may we be people who return, with our spouses, inshallah, for those of us who have them, to be people of piety and taqwa. And I pray for all of the younger Muslims or those who have lost spouses, that they find deep companionship, inshallah.
Ameen. Thank you so much. And inshallah, we'll meet again, same time, same place, in 1 week, inshallah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.